I'm going to be talking this evening about applying psychology to help people make better choices. By way of some kind of introduction, my name is John Maule. I'm Emeritus Professor of Human Decision Making in the Business School. I'm a psychologist by background and have actually been doing research on the psychology of decision making for well over 40 years. When I began, there were very few of us doing it. Now, under the guise of behavioural economics, everybody wants to know about it. I'm particularly upset, given that I have taken part retirement, that suddenly an area that I have known for many years was going to be so important now has been recognised as such. And over the course of this lecture, I want to perhaps remind some of you who may well have had the misfortune to sit in my classes before and to be preached at about the importance of this area. I'm going to remind you of some of those key issues. I'm also going to bring it up to date a little bit and going to be talking a little bit about the application and the importance of the area, because not only is it a fantastic area to work in as far as pure research is concerned, equally I think it's got some important lessons for those of us that are working, and indeed those of us that are not, for anybody that has to make decisions. Okay, so the objectives of my presentation will be to review, albeit very briefly, research on how people take decisions. I'm going to focus on the thinking and reasoning that people use. As those of you that have been in my classes before could predict, I'm going to give you 4 or 5 problems to solve over the course of the evening as a means to showing you these effects in your behaviours, because I'm not talking about abstract people out there, I'm talking about you, and I think it helps to bring it home if you see what I'm talking about in your own behaviours. What I want to do is to talk a little bit about some of the factors that reduce the effectiveness of human decision making. I want to talk a little bit about ways of improving human decision making. And I want to talk about something that, if you listen to the Today programme, seems to be mentioned every other day. I want to talk about nudging and some of the implications of nudging achieving what are so-called socially desirable choices in people. And then I'm going to finish by telling you a little bit about the work that's currently going on in the Centre for Decision Research in the Business School. Because I have to say, over the last 3 or 4 years, the work has expanded hugely, and there really is a lot of very interesting stuff. I don't only want to inform you, I want to invite you to get involved with it if you're so inclined, and so hopefully that will come at the end of the lecture. Okay, so let's have a little bit of background about the area that I'm going to be talking about. Up until about 30, 40 years ago, it was assumed that people are rational decision makers. And the dominance of economics meant that the assumption was that people acted rationally. That is, that they knew all the alternatives that were available to them. They had all the information they needed, including their beliefs and values, and they were able to do mental calculations in their heads so that they chose the best option. Now, I'm not going to go in too much about how improbable a hypothesis that was at the beginning, but psychology has shown that that really isn't a sensible way of thinking about how people actually make decisions. There is now a good deal of research to suggest that people rely on a much more intuitive kind of thinking than is supposed by the economic model, this rational calculative form. And these days, we make a distinction between 2 different kinds of thinking, and these are the kinds of thinking that underpin all the decisions you take, whether it be professional or personal. In popular language, you often hear people talking about gut and brain, or intuition and deliberation. What I'm going to do is going to talk about System 1 and System 2 thinking. And to help you understand them, I'm now going, can I get the problem sheets out? What I'm going to do, there will be a problem sheet for each side of the room. You'll need a pen. If you don't have a pen, there are lots of pens available, branded pens, of course, so you'll be able to take your Leeds University Business School pen with you. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you 3 problems. And what I shall want you to do is to write down the answer to those 3 problems. I didn't put the sheets actually on the chair before because you will have looked at them in advance, and what I want you to do is not to have the benefit of a good deal of deliberation. So basically I'm going to give you 3 problems, and I'll wait until everybody has a sheet. You can take these sheets home with you at the end. I shall not be... Okay, I'm going to give you problem 1 now, and I want you just to write down the answer next where it says problem 1 on the sheet. Okay, the first problem is, what is 2 add 2? And I'm not one of these arty-farty psychologists with these oblique problems. All my problems should be seen purely at face value. The second problem is, what is 29 add 92? And the third problem is, what is 34,986 add 87,398? And no, I will not be repeating that. Okay, let's just think how you solve those problems. The first problem, 2 add 2, everybody knows that 2 and 2 make 4. The answer pops out your head automatically with no calculation. It's just part of what we know. So there wasn't any conscious thought, it just something came into consciousness and there was the answer. The second one is slightly different because unless you've been, as some of you have been, to my talks before, you won't know the answer, so you have to work it from first principles, which means that inside your working memory, which is kind of like the central processor of a computer, you have to store the 2 and the 9 and the 9 and the 2, and then you have to carry out some computations. You have to add the 9 and the 2, and you have to remember the 1 and the carry and so on and so forth. So most of you will manage that, but that will have taken conscious thought. It will have taken deliberative thought. Now the third problem is almost impossible to do. People can't even remember 2 5-digit numbers, let alone carry out the calculations. And what this shows us is that when people engage in deliberative thought, it is severely limited in terms of its capacity, in terms of the mental operations it can take. So those decisions that involve deliberative thought are likely to involve working memory and limited capacity. And that's one of the most important factors that determines the kind of decisions that we take. To be deliberative is to be costly, and it's hard, and if we have complex problems that we need to solve, we soon run into difficulties. Okay, now I've described 2 different kinds of thinking, and these days it's popular to talk about System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 thinking is quick. 2 add 2 kind of occurred the answer automatically. It's intuitive in the sense that it requires very little attention. It just pops out. We're not really aware of any kind of process that we've gone through. It requires very little conscious attention. It just appears there, but the activity prior to that, leading up to it, isn't in conscious attention. It uses very little mental effort, and it's often based on affect, that is, on feelings, on emotions. And emotions provide a very, very firm foundation for System 1 thinking. System 2 thinking, on the other hand, is much more analytical and deliberative. We tend to work through a process. It's under conscious control and requires mental effort. Tired people engage in less System 2 thinking because they have less mental effort available to them. And System 2 thinking is very much bound up by limited capacity processing. We can't do very much. It's almost like we're much more like a BBC B, if any of you can remember what a BBC B computer was like, with a very, very limited central processor rather than one of the really complicated machines that we have today. Now, there are some key characteristics about each of those systems of thinking that are really crucial. System 1 thinking occurs continuously in the background. It's not under conscious control. It's kind of rather like an iceberg. It's that whatever percentage is, a large percentage that occurs below the sea level, in this case below consciousness. What System 1 does is deliver impressions, interpretations, evaluations. We're aware of it in terms of things like, oh, this feels right, or, oh, this makes me anxious. We're aware of the outcomes of those processes, and they suddenly appear in consciousness. Now, these feelings and impressions provide powerful guides to decisions. We often choose what feels right. We often avoid what makes us anxious. So these System 1 impressions and feelings are a major guide to our decisions. And people accept these relatively uncritically. A huge amount of decision making, including very important decisions, are based on System 1 thinking. System 2 thinking has two roles. One important role is that it's a monitor. System 2 monitors the outputs of System 1 and kind of looks and says, shall I go with it, shall I not? It probably doesn't quite say it in that way. But there are mechanisms within System 2 thinking that can mean either the System 1 impressions are accepted, and that's what you go with, or that there is some feeling, I'm not too sure about this, oh, I need to think about this a little bit more. There's a lot of research on those feelings and how they determine this, which I'm not going to be talking about. And under those circumstances, people often then follow a more deliberative line that might be based on rules that they've learned in their professional lives. It might be rules that they've learned through their personal lives. But this is more rule-based, deliberative type of thinking that leads then to the final choice. Now, given that System 2 thinking is hard work and uses up mental effort, I'm afraid to say there's a strong bias for System 2 to accept what System 1 does and says and provides, even when it's inappropriate. And to illustrate this a little bit, what I'd like you now all is to look at problem 4. And here's problem 4, and I'm going to get you to do this quickly because at the moment you're now all looking for catches and looking for angles and know that there's going to be something that you need to pick up. But just intuitively, if I said to you a bat and ball cost £1.10 in total, the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Write down your answer now. Okay. Who thinks that the ball costs 10p? Just put your hands up, quite a lot of you. Okay, well I'm afraid you're all wrong, because if it was 10p, the bat would then have to be £1. Sorry, if it's 10p, then it's £1, and then the difference isn't exactly what we said. The ball should cost you 5p. Now, a lot of people actually make this mistake. The actual division should be £1 and 5p and 5p. It adds up to £1.10, and there's a £1 difference. But a lot of people, including incredibly clever graduates at Harvard and lots of American universities, fall foul of this. The reason is that intuitively it's good to make divisions at obvious points, and an obvious point is £1. So intuition is going to deliver £1 as the division between the bat and the ball. And because System 2 doesn't always monitor as carefully as it ought, your System 2 accepted that intuitive but incorrect response. And lots of people fall foul of it. Okay, this is a very simple, trivial problem, but the message is important. System 2 does not intervene as often as it should and allows far too many incorrect assumptions and choices through. The other interesting thing to note is that, well, as I've said, many decisions are based on System 1 thinking, even important ones. It's interesting, if you ask people to explain how they've made a choice, they will always explain it in System 2 terms. Well, yes, I gave that a lot of thought, and whereas that occurs even when we know they have based it on System 1 intuition. So people will provide you accounts of how they've done it, which are not correct. And so we often fool ourselves into assuming that we've been much more deliberative and analytical than we really have. So what is important that we need to understand much more about System 1 thinking, when it's used, its implications for effectiveness, and what we can do to help people make better choices given that we have this information. And that's what we're going to come on to next. Now, there is a mass of research now on System 1 thinking, on the heuristics, the simple forms of thinking that people use. I'm just going to illustrate 2 or 3, but don't believe that that's all that there is out there. There's masses of this material now. And I'm going to begin by a good old favourite on decision framing. And I'm going to begin that by asking you now all to look at problem 5. Those of you that have been in my classes in the past will certainly recognise this problem. Try not to remember what you did. Try just, again, don't look for the catch. Just say, on the basis of this information, intuitively I think I'd either choose A or B. And you might say, why don't you shut up? I'm trying to concentrate. I'm doing this because I'm encouraging, when I'm talking, it makes it even more difficult for you to engage in System 2 thinking. So I'm trying to maximise the opportunities of getting the effect. I don't want you to say, I'm now going to move on because I really wanted a quick intuitive decision from you. If you haven't made the choice, then you'll just have to split between making the decision and what I'm saying. Okay, I'm now going to introduce a concept, decision framing, and I'm going to debrief that problem in a few minutes. Okay, decision framing, all you really need to know is that people make sense of situations around them by building mental models inside their heads. For all we know, there may be a reality out there, but what we do is to construct a model of reality inside our heads, and we assume that that model is accurate, and what we do, we act and make decisions on the assumption that that model is correct. The problem is, how we develop models inside our heads, how we develop decision frames, is very much based on System 1 thinking. We know quite a lot about that I don't have time to go through. But the fact is that System 1 thinking, when we're building these models, means that they're often biased and partial. Psychologists have known this for a long time, and here's a bit of pop psychology, and for that I apologise, but it allows me to make the point. If asked what you see here, most people, if they don't know the Muller-Lie illusion, will say, oh, well, there's 2 lines and the bottom one is longer than the top one. And that's how it looks to me, even though I know that's not the case. Because if I draw lines in front of them like that, then you can see that the 2 lines are actually the same length. But there's something about the context, and this is the crucial word, there's something about the context in which that piece of information is delivered that biases our mental models. Now, if that was a bit of cheap psychology, there's worse to come. I shouldn't think there's a person on the planet that hasn't seen this illusion, the old woman, young woman illusion. This is a situation that can be modelled in 2 different ways. And of course, not only is that interesting in terms of the perceptual phenomena that are involved here, but more importantly, if you model this situation as a young woman, we would behave differently as compared with modelling as an old woman. That is, that the situation, the model that we construct, makes some choices and options much more reasonable than others. So as we would switch from a young woman to an old woman, then the choices that we might end up making would be different. And I want to argue that most of the decisions that you take are as arbitrary as this, that they can be modelled in different ways, but because we tend to accept all too readily the first model that we have, we fail to recognise the biases that exist in our current model. Now, to try and make that point, what I need to do now is to debrief problem 5. Now, what I'm unsure about, half of you, can I just check, which side of the room have got saved rather than lost in problem 5? So these, yours should be lost. The problem looks very similar, but yours is lost. Okay, so I'm going to address this side of the room. They were told about this unusual disease in America, which is quite timely given Ebola and all the other things, but that wasn't the reason it's here. You have to make a choice between two options. How many of you chose A? Okay, so the majority chose A. Now this side of the room actually got the same problem, except that they were told, they were given the red version of the alternatives rather than the green. You recognise the green version in yours that was saved, but the version that this side of the room got was to emphasise the losses rather than the gains. They're the same alternatives because clearly if 200 people are saved, 400 people will die. How many of you went for B? Okay, so it's a small majority, not as dramatic as it often is. One of the problems you have whenever you use these problems, you're relying on the fact that the effects that are very well established in the literature work out. I've used this problem a lot, as many of you will have recognised it, and generally it works very well. What does this mean? The point to be made from this is that here's a problem that can either be modelled in gains or in losses. And we know when we model problems in gains, we tend to be risk averse. Our risk attitude is more towards aversion. When we model problems in losses, however, people are much more risk seeking. And we got that effect to some degree in the room here. Now, which is the correct way of presenting this problem? I don't know. They are two equally probable and reasonable ways of capturing that problem. And much like the young woman or old woman illusion that we talked about, here's a problem that can be captured in different ways. And what we discover, when we model a problem in gains, people are quite risk averse in terms of their choices. When we model things in losses, people are much more risk seeking. And that is a very robust effect. And I'm going to tell you about some of the research that we have done and that others have done to support this. Some years ago, we ran a big experiment with the top strategic decision makers in a very well-known building society not far away from Leeds. And what we did, we developed a case study that very much reflected one of the strategic problems that that building society were facing. And we constructed a case, and then we gave them some strategic options to choose between. And unbeknown to them, half those receiving the case and the options had the options defined in terms of gains, what each of those strategic options would bring by way of gains. And the other half were given the problem in terms of losses. And what we discovered was that those extremely experienced decision makers dealing with a very familiar strategic problem that they were currently facing were grossly affected by the framing of the problem. And those that had received the version emphasising the gains took the much less risky options for the strategic plans over the next 5 to 10 years. Those that received exactly the same information but emphasising losses were much more likely to choose the riskier options. We also did some research on bank accounts, which was perhaps when you are at a call centre and you're trying to sell people a new bank product, should you emphasise the gains from taking the product or the losses from not taking it? It makes a difference. And there is a much bigger uptake when you emphasise the losses rather than the gains. Interesting, politicians apparently fall foul of this as well. Some of the discussions of political scientists have looked at George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr., both of whom had decisions to take about Iraq and whether to go to war. When you look at how George Bush Sr. framed his decision, the kind of dialogue that he had both privately and publicly, his was all about the gains of doing this and the gains of doing that. So the options were very much framed in gains. Where you look at George Bush Jr., a similar analysis shows that he emphasised the losses much more than the gains. And on the assumption that going to war is a much more riskier endeavour than actually not, then some political scientists have argued it's clearly not as simple as that, but one of the drivers and pushes that might have influenced the kind of choices made was very much how they had framed the problems. Lastly, it was very interesting, where you give people money unexpectedly, you could give people either money that could be seen as a tax rebate or as a bonus. Now, a bonus is a gain. The tax rebate is the return of a loss. So again, we've got this difference between gain and loss. And it's interesting, if you frame extra money as a tax rebate, people save it. If you frame it as a bonus, people spend it. And interestingly, the American government some years back tried to stimulate the economy, and guess what they did? They gave people a tax rebate, and all people tended to do was to save it, which was not the purpose of the policy at all. So what I want to do is to show you that while we did this rather simple little experiment here in the room, and that was with a relatively trivial problem, that the effects that I'm talking about have been well substantiated across a huge range of different domains. The simple message is people are incredibly uncritical about their frames and very unaware of the inherent bias. Daniel Kahneman, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which hopefully some of you have read. If you haven't, then it's an ace book to read, talks about Whizziati. What you see is all there is. And what we tend to do, we're all too ready to accept the very simple interpretation of the problem that we hold with inside our heads. And I believe that there are institutional ways. In organisations, you find this is the way we think about that problem round here. And these become embedded in the culture of the organisation, so any inherent biases are just replicated over and over again. So can we do anything about it? Well, yes, we can. There are a whole range of very smart decision aids that you can use to help people develop more elaborate decision frames. The study that I talked about with the well-known building society close to Leeds, what we did, we looked at the impact of cognitive mapping, which is simply getting people to use pen and paper to draw a map, to draw a representation of the problem. And of course, if you're using pen and paper, you can actually put down much more than you can hold inside your head. And we discovered that those people who actually used cognitive mapping prior to making their choices did not fall foul of the bias. Now, that work was published, I'm very glad to say, in the
Strategic Management Journal, which was a very nice hit for us, being a top journal. But happily send some of that or any of the material that I'm talking about to you. Okay, so that is the first effect that I want to talk about. I'm now going to talk about a couple of other effects, System 1 forms of thinking that I think are important, that impact on the kind of decisions that people take. So the second one I'm going to talk about is loss aversion. Now, I'm going to illustrate it, as I always tend to, by a very simple problem. I've got £50 here. Okay. Now, being a poor academic, I doubt I'll be doing this for real, but anyway, let's pretend it's for real. I've got £50 here, and I've got a coin in my pocket. And I'm going to toss a coin. If it comes down heads, you give me the £50. If it comes down tails, I'll give you £50, okay? Now, so the bet's very, and I can assure you that the coin I've got is a fair coin, so there's a 50-50 chance. How many of you would be willing to take the bet? Okay. Okay, one or two people, okay. You're not allowed to vote. Now, okay. Now then, let's say that I have a slightly different coin that maybe 55% of the time comes down heads and 45 becomes tails. Then how many people would pay the bet? Okay, so people... Now, can you see, when it's a 50-50 bet, you've got an equal chance of winning as losing. Then actually, if you did these sums and you looked at the rational choice, then you've got an equal chance of winning or losing. Now, as I change either the probabilities or the amounts in favour of you rather than me, as I did, I said, okay, you've got a 55% chance of winning now, and I've only got a 45% chance. Still, most of you weren't willing to actually play the bet because, well, not because, you weren't willing to play the bet despite the fact that now the odds are in favour of you, and the amount, if you worked out what is often called the subjective expected value, it's stronger for you than for me. Now, we could keep improving the bet for you over me, and asked at what point would you suddenly find that acceptable? And what's interesting is that gains have to be almost 2.5 times better than losses before people will engage in the gamble. It's just the loss of £50 is so much more dramatic than the gain of £50. The impact that it has on you is so much more. And this is what we call loss aversion. People are loss averse. People don't like losses. And even in situations, and it could be rather than a gamble, it could be an investment, and even in investment situations where everything is stacked up in favour of the win rather than the lose, the win just has to be so much bigger than the loss, maybe 2.5 times, before people will accept the gamble. And so we can see through investment, through for professionals as well as less professional individuals, this impact of loss aversion in financial and in other domains, as we shall see. If I was to say to you, right, now I'm going to give you 55% chance of winning, so my bias coin, 55% heads, 45 tails, and I'm going to toss it up 100 times, and we're going to play 100 shots now than just the simple one shot. How many of you would be willing to play 100 shots at a 55-45 in your advantage? Okay, so suddenly now, if you knew we were going to play several shots where the probabilities in your favour would have plenty of chance to come out, then people tend to want to play it. The trouble is, people are myopic when they look at their own investments. A portfolio is supposed to spread the risk, and portfolios are supposed to be to give people the impression of the multi-play rather than the single play. But people, when they look at their investments, they do so in a myopic way, and they tend to see each investment as a single shot rather than a multiple shot, which of course a portfolio is. This is part of the reason, part of the explanation for what's often called the equity premium puzzle. For the last 100 years, stocks have significantly outperformed bonds. But because people are myopic and because they tend to see their investments in this myopic way, the risks, the potential loss associated with stocks and loss aversion means that people don't follow the best kind of investment. This explains why people often end up making inappropriate choices. This actually, the whole concept of loss aversion can be seen outside of the financial domain. For example, let's imagine, and I meant to bring one of these, but anyway, let's imagine I had a beautiful Leeds University Business School mug. And for this side of the room, I gave you the mug. And this side of the room, I gave you the money. It's your mug, it's your money. And then I say to these, what's the minimum you'll accept for the mug? In other words, now you own it, how much recompense, what's the minimum recompense you'll need before you'll sell that mug to this side of the room? And for you, I shall say to you, what's the maximum amount you'd be willing to pay for one of these mugs? It's the same mug, and I've chosen you at random. The experiments that have been done in America, you find that, and this was an old experiment, but nevertheless I'm going to deal with dollars. The dollar price that this lot are likely to demand is over $7. I think it's near enough $7.50. And you wouldn't accept anything less than that, whereas this side of the room would be unwilling to pay anything more than $3.3. So we've got the same object, but it's valued differently. Once people own something, getting rid of it is a loss. And so they really need to be recompensed by quite an amount to give up something that they own. There's many everyday examples of this impacting on decisions. For example, the disposition effect in trading means that people hang on to losses far too long. People don't like losses, so we've got a difference between a paper loss and a realised loss. And the paper loss is bad enough, but a realised loss is just too much. And so where you look at trading patterns amongst professionals, but certainly amongst less professional people, this particular effect, the disposition effect, has a dramatic effect. Let's say that you are a hospital administrator and you're going to have to bring two hospitals together. It makes sense to improve the services. You can improve services if you combine the two hospitals rather than keeping them separate. A big debate that has been going on in the health service now for some time. The difficulty is that members of the public will feel, quotes, they're losing their hospital. And under those circumstances, loss aversion means that what you're going to give them in place doesn't have to be just a little bit better, but demonstrably better. And of course, that's often very hard to do. So in the public domain, loss aversion can also have dramatic effects. As I've already indicated, in finance, investment portfolios are risk averse. These have huge impacts, but they're very difficult to change. There are probably very good biological and emotional reasons that make us so loss averse. But that system one feeling, oh God, no, I don't want it, I feel anxious about it, whatever the emotional response is, has a dramatic effect and considerably reduces the quality of our decision making. Okay, I'm going to spin through this next one somewhat quickly, and I'm going to ask you just to read that question, and I'm going to take a straw vote to see how many of you would agree to let your daughter. I do have to say that I had an MBA class at Leeds some years back, And one of the questions when I presented this was, how expensive was the dog? which I thought was a bit unfair. Okay, let's just take a straw poll. How many of you would let your daughter go? Okay, most of you. How many of you wouldn't? Okay, so we're fairly well split. I'm less interested in who did and did not. I'm much more interested in how you arrived at some kind of risk assessment. What was the basis of your risk assessment? Did you use a System 2 form of thinking where you did a thorough risk analysis based on data? Do you know the rate of abductions, both generally and in your local area? In other words, did you use some deliberation? I very much doubt it. I think it's much more likely that you used a form of System 1 thinking that we call availability thinking. Availability thinking is where you use how easy it is to bring past instances to mind as a basis of judging how likely they are to occur in the future. So let's illustrate that. Let's say that in your life you've just had a whole series of triangles, and those triangles, the number of events that are in your memory, the number of individual events that there are in your memories will determine how easy it is to bring one to mind. So you can imagine, if you have relatively few triangles, relatively few instances in your memory, it's hard to bring an instant to mind, so you're likely to judge the thing as unlikely. If you've got lots of examples, then you're more likely to judge the thing as being quite likely. And that's kind of a very smart, simple, intuitive focusing device, because most forecasting uses the past to predict the future. And if things have happened a lot in the past, all other things being equal, we're going to predict they occur a lot in the future. The trouble is there are some events which leave very dramatic memory traces. And although these events don't occur very often, because these memories are very dramatic, they are much more readily brought to mind. And so people consistently over-predict the likelihood of dramatic events. So events perhaps that may be based on personal experience, things that have happened to you in your past that have left very dramatic memory traces, you're likely to overestimate the likelihood of those things happening in the future. We have the press and the media that deliver a lot of information about what happens about celebrities. Equally, we have the media focused on the dramatic plane crashes rather than car crashes, and people consistently overestimate the likelihood of being involved in a plane crash than a car crash. 2 days after 9/11, it so happened that my brother was travelling to America to see his son, and he phoned me up and he said to me, "John, do you think it's safe to travel?" My advice was, drive very carefully to the airport. Because plane crashes are dramatic, car crashes are not, and we consistently misrepresent and misjudge the risks because we're using partial and biased data sets. Here's some everyday examples. I've worked with information security experts. These are experts in big organizations who often take a lot of data about problems that occur with their information systems. Research shows they consistently spend too much money on the dramatic, hackers, and not nearly enough on the mundane, that the system is simply underpowered, so can't deal with peaks of demand. And despite the fact that these individuals take a lot of data and they've got all the data available to them, they'd much rather use personal experience. You know, I've been doing this job now for 20, 25 years. I've built up a lot of experience. My judgment is good. If anybody ever says that to you, discount probably everything else that follows. So information security experts get it wrong. Performance appraisals. we tend to remember when we're making performance appraisals, we tend to remember the dramatic rather than the everyday and usual. We're doing some work at the moment with the Legal Services Board on how the public are going to deal with all the changes in legal services that are going on. And they're going to often have to make judgments about whether they should or should not take legal action. So let's say it's a custody case, divorce, custody. The danger is that if a very high-profile figure has recently had a very successful custody case, that's going to be very memorable, and therefore people are likely to overestimate the chances of their own success, and thereby perhaps now engage in quite expensive litigation that is not necessarily going to be successful. It's interesting, this spills over into policy as well, where you look at how governments spend money to mitigate risks. They're hugely biased towards the high available dramatic, and they consistently spend insufficient on the mundane. So we're all subject to this bias, and it's very hard to break away from it. How can we help people overcome this bias? I think we have to learn to challenge professional judgments much more. And if you wanted one simple thing to introduce into all your decisions, it's a devil's advocate. Somebody that sits there and says, okay, why do you think that's true? Now, if somebody normally does that, you think, is that person after my job? Is that, well, you know, what's the agenda here? But if I'm the devil's advocate one day and you're the devil's advocate the next and then you the next after, then we know it's a role, and that then gets beyond the simple system one form of thinking. And quite simply, we need to encourage people to collect and use representative data. There's a lot of it out there, but professionals just don't like using it, unfortunately. And of course, we can flip that around. Many health campaigns are based on availability. They try to have something that's dramatic, that will then stick in people's minds so that they might then judge risks differently. Okay, conclusions from this: people rely heavily on system one thinking. Interestingly, when you put people in groups, these just don't disappear, these system one forms of thinking. Sometimes they get even worse. You know, you've probably all heard of groupthink, and groupthink is quite a lot about an enhancement of system one thinking. There are advantages of system one thinking, and we shouldn't lose those. They make complex problems tractable. We can quickly and relatively effortlessly come to a conclusion. And do you know what? More often than not, what system one thinking comes up with is okay. So we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater and ban all intuition. That's not my message. My message is intuition is really useful and helpful, but it should be informed intuition. We should be much more sensitive to some of the ways in which intuition can lead us astray, and thereby perhaps much more likely to engage in that system two thinking that's needed. So disadvantages can lead to bias. People are unaware and often confident of their choices, even though they're just patently wrong. And we know that some of the major reasons for individual and organisational failure can be traced back. So we need to encourage people. How can we need to help people to make better decisions. We can teach people decision thinking skills, and some of you who have been on my MBA or undergraduate courses know that that's part of what I was trying to achieve, teaching people decision thinking skills. We can help people use decision aids. We can help people better understand what kind of quantitative data they need to take and how to use it. But of course, recently, a recognition that people use system one forms of thinking and that system one forms of thinking leads to predictable choices has been used by policymakers to introduce nudges. Now, nudging is something that really over the last 8, 9, 10 years has become big business, both for governments and for organisations. And nudging is all about setting the decision context in such a way that it induces a particular form of System 1 thinking, and because it leads to that particular form of System 1 thinking, people are then more likely to choose, quotes, the socially desirable option. So if we know how people think and when they think, and how that will lead them to preferences for one option rather than another, we can set up contexts that will nudge people. Now, nudge rather than force, because we're not forcing them to choose A over B, but we're setting the context that makes it more likely that they'll choose A over B. So if you were wanted to nudge healthy eating in a buffet bar, you put most of the healthy food at the beginning, because people take more of what is at the start of the buffet bar than at the end. Now, you're not stopping people having pie, chips and beans, because that's still available, at least that's the argument, but you're encouraging them because you know people choose those things that occur first, more of them. The endowment effect, you remember I talked about the mugs, and once you own something you value it more. The whole basis of work-based pensions is based on that particular effect. If we give people a pension but allow them to opt out, they're much more likely to stick with it than if we give them a straight choice between taking a pension or not. And we have a huge experiment going on in the UK at this moment in time based on work-based pensions, nudging based around an aspect of the endowment effect called the default effect. Health campaigns. If we want to encourage women to engage in breast self-examination, then this time we can nudge them through framing. And rather than emphasizing the gains from self-examination, if we emphasize the losses from not engaging in self-examination, losses having a bigger impact than gains, we discover that the campaigns are much more effective. So again, more people or more women engage in breast self-examination if we frame in a way that nudges towards examination. Some of you may be aware that we have the UK Nudge Unit, and the Nudge Unit is working with public sector, private sector. I'm working with our local council on these things, and they've been to the Nudge Unit and they're talking about ways of achieving policy objectives much more efficiently, maybe things like littering. I mean, our local authority, the big problem is chewing gum. They spend thousands and thousands of pounds on clearing up chewing gum. It happens to be a very hard one to nudge, as it happens. Now, it raises ethical problems, of course, because who's going to determine what is acceptable and what isn't? Something we might pick up in some questions, but it is very fast developing. Nudging is something that, as I say, even private sector organisations are using now, and maybe marketeers are using. So maybe we all ought to be a little bit more aware of nudging as well, because it may well be that whilst it might be used to achieve socially desirable outcomes, it might also be used to achieve outcomes that might seem to be less socially desirable. So that's a little trot round the field, giving you some of the work that's currently going on generally. Some of it has developed a lot further than I've presented. I've also tried to indicate some of the impact in terms of how we can help people overcome these things, and also to talk a little bit about the impact on nudging, which seems to be the way this body of work has been applied, not just in the UK or the USA, but universally. I mean, there's a nudge unit, I think, now in Australia, you know, and commercial organisations, as I say, are beginning to buy into this. So I'd like to finish up just 2 minutes, is that okay, just 2 minutes? Just to talk a little bit now about what we're doing at Leeds, because I'm really pleased to say that the Centre for Decision Research at Leeds has expanded hugely over the last 3 or 4 years. We've got a real caucus of staff there now engaging in a lot of very good and interesting research. And I thought I'd just share with you some of the work that's going on. I'm sorry about bunging so much stuff on one slide, but nevertheless, and I don't intend to say too much about any one of these. One body of work is looking at household finance decision-making and financial distress. We're doing a lot of work in this area and in some of the other things that I shall be talking about, looking at ageing, looking at the difference between older people and younger people. In my case, of course, it's self-interest, but nevertheless, it is quite an interesting, because most of the work has assumed that all individuals are the same, and it's clearly not true. And there's been a lot of work at Leeds now on how older decision makers are different from their younger counterparts. But this work has looked at older people, is looked around debt and public perception of inflation. So that we've got a whole body of work in that. We've got a whole body of work around health decision making, how to design graphs to better communicate health risks, how to design decision aids to help people make choices between medical treatments. Decision aids in medicine have been going for a very long time, but we've got 2 or 3 people who have got some considerable specialism in that and have developed lots of really, really excellent decision aids that have been validated and proven to be very useful. We've got a whole bunch of stuff on environmental decision making, stuff on perceptions of climate change and the weather, preparedness for heat waves in the UK, chance would be a fine thing, preparedness for flooding, this is an American, all this is funded research, I hasten to say, with external grants either from the UK or the USA. This one is in America on flooding, but obviously has quite a lot of resonance here in the UK, and on perceptions of low carbon electricity generation. We've got a whole bunch of stuff on food, reducing food waste, maybe using nudges there, that you can see how that would come in, consumer responses to food. We're doing a body of work on big data and business analytics, which resonates with what I said about how important it is to take appropriate data and learn how to use it to improve strategic choices. And as I've already indicated, we've got a lot of stuff, and the new professor that we've got, Wandy Bruin de Bruin, has actually over the last 10 years done some really, really interesting work on older decision makers, and what are the things that older people do well and what are the things older people do less well. So that is the work that we've got on, and I'd like to think that if I was to give this lecture in 10 years' time, that I would be able to draw out much more about those particular projects, because they're just, some of them have been going 2 or 3 years, but they are just beginning to emerge. And the unit itself, the centre, is now a very vibrant place. And I'm going to finish by inviting you to take part in any way that you want with the centre's activity. We're always looking for the involvement of alumni. Maybe some aspects of what I've spoken about here may be of interest to you. Come and talk to us. We're not always looking for money, you know. Sometimes we're looking for collaboration. Sometimes we're just happy to talk about the things that we're really interested in. And so I want to finish by inviting you to do that, and inviting any questions that you may have that you like to ask on my presentation or on anything else.